I have stood a great many night watches in the east wing of Harrowgate, and I have learned that a palace after midnight is not silent. It ticks. It settles. Old timber cools and groans. The pipes behind the plaster knock like a second heartbeat. Somewhere a clock that has not been right in 40 years chimes the hour it wishes it were. A man learns the palace's sounds the way he learns his own breathing, and after a while he stops hearing them at all. What he hears instead is the sound that does not belong. That is what woke me from the flat. Upright doze a guardsman calls standing rest, not a sound, but the wrong absence of one. My name is Corran Aldwin, and on the night this began I had 13 years on the household detail and a reputation, mostly deserved, for being the dullest reliable man in the corps. I did not gossip. I did not speculate. I stood my post, I logged what I was told to log, and I went home to a narrow flat and a cat that tolerated me. If you had asked the officers who I was, they would have said, "Aldwin, steady." Won't surprise you. They meant it as praise, and I took it as such. I did not yet know that the dullest reliable man is exactly the man a secret walks past without slowing, because it has decided he will not understand what he sees. The corridor I held that night ran the length of the east wing's second floor, past the linen stores and the disused music room and the door to the archive stair, and it ended at the tall arched window that looked down into the inner courtyard. It was March, and the courtyard was black and wet, the fountain shut off for the season, and the only light was the cold blue wash of the security lamps that came on at 11 and stayed on till dawn. I was watching that light do nothing at all when I understood what had changed. The camera at the far end of the corridor, the little gray eye tucked under the cornice above the archive door, had gone dark. Not off. Its status lamp, a pinprick of red that burned steady every night of the year, was out. I want to be precise about what I felt, because everything that followed turned on it. I did not feel alarm. A dead camera is a maintenance ticket, not a crisis. The system was old and cameras dropped offline the way old men drop names. What I felt was the small, particular itch of a thing out of order, the same itch that makes you straighten a crooked picture without deciding to. I noted the time, 12:41, and I began to walk the corridor to have a look, because that is what you do, and because a corridor with one dark eye in it is a corridor you would rather see with your own. I had gone perhaps 20 paces when the archive door opened. It opened slowly, from the inside, the way a door opens when the person behind it is listening as they move it. A wedge of dimmer light fell across the runner, and then a figure stepped out into the corridor, closed the door with the same listening care, and stood for a moment with one hand flat against the wood as if to keep it from sighing, and I stopped where I was, in the shadow between two lamps, because the figure was Princess Elara. She was in a plain dark coat over what I took to be night clothes, her hair pinned up in a hurry, and she was not supposed to be there. I do not mean it was forbidden. She was a daughter of the house, and every door in the east wing would open to her hand. I mean that the Princess Elara the palace knew did not walk the archive corridor at 1:45 in the morning with a killed camera behind her. She was the composed one, the careful one, the one who did everything in the daylight and by the book. Whatever this was, it was not on any schedule I had ever been handed. I did the correct thing, which was to make my presence known before she came upon me in the dark and cried out. I stepped into the lamplight, kept my hands visible, and said, "Lo, Your Highness, Guardsman Aldwin, you're safe, it's only me." She did not cry out. That was the first thing that told me she had planned this. A person surprised in the dark flinches. The princess only turned her head, found me, and went very still, the stillness of someone doing arithmetic at speed. Then she let out a breath and lowered her hand from the door. "Aldwin," she said, "East Wing tonight." "I'd forgotten they moved you." "2 nights now, ma'am." I kept my voice at the register we use for the small hours, the one pitched not to travel. "Is everything in order?" It was the most ordinary question in the corps, and she heard everything under it. She looked at me for a long moment, and I watched her decide something. I have thought about that moment many times since. The moment a careful woman chose to trust the dullest reliable man in the corps because he happened to be the one standing where the secret came out. If a livelier man had held the post that night, a talker, she might have sent him off with a word, and I would never have known any of it. Instead, she looked at Corran Aldwin, who did not gossip and did not speculate, and she decided I would do. "No," she said. "Nothing is in order. Come here and keep your voice down, and do not write this in your log." Now, a guardsman's log is close to sacred. What we see, we record. That is the whole of our reliability. To be told by a member of the House not to log something is to be handed a small, heavy problem, and every instinct I had told me to say, respectfully, that I could not comply. But I did not say it, and I have never regretted the silence, because when I came closer and she turned the little screen of the tablet in her hand toward me, I understood in 3 seconds that this was not a thing that belonged in a log where a dozen indifferent eyes would skim it by morning. On the screen was a document I recognized and was never meant to see. It was a medical record. The header alone told me that, the crest and the coded reference and the words restricted household medical, access by consent only running along the top in the flat gray type of an official form. Below it, columns, dates, values I did not understand, and a name in the patient field that I did understand because it was hers. "That is yours," I said before I could stop myself. "It is mine." She turned the screen back before I could read a word of the detail, and I was grateful. There are doors a man should not want opened, and a person's medical record is one of them. 6 days ago, she went on, a version of that record, that exact record, down to a note my physician made in the margin and initialed and that exists nowhere else, appeared in the hands of someone who had no right to it. I will not tell you who or how I know. It isn't yours to carry, and it would only put you in a worse spot than I'm already putting you in. What I will tell you is this. That record lives in 3 places. My physician's private file, which is locked and off the household system entirely. The consent copy in the archive behind that door, which requires 2 keys and a signature to withdraw, and which has not been withdrawn, I have just checked, and the withdrawal register is clean. And the household medical archive proper, the digital one, which is supposed to be sealed to everyone but the King's medical office and me. She looked at me steadily. Someone is reading my sealed record and passing it on. I have spent 4 nights trying to find how, because I cannot go to the household security office. Why not? I asked. It was, I thought, the obvious question. The household security office existed to catch exactly this. "Because," she said, "the only people with the standing to unseal that record and the access to move it without a trace are the people the household security office answers to. If I raise this by the ordinary channels, I am asking the fox to investigate the henhouse, and the fox will investigate very thoroughly and find nothing, and then I will have shown my hand. I have one advantage, Aldwin, and it is that whoever is doing this does not yet know that I know. The moment I file a report, that advantage is gone." She glanced at the dead camera under the cornice, and I understood at last why it was dark. I put that offline myself before I came down. I'll put it back when I'm done. I needed to move through this corridor without leaving a picture of myself doing it, because I do not know who reviews those pictures or why. I am not a quick man, but I am a thorough one, and standing in that cold corridor, I did the same arithmetic she had done and arrived at the same terrible sum. The princess suspected someone inside the house, someone with keys and standing and the power to make an investigation come back empty, and she had no one she could hand it to, because the people she would ordinarily hand it to were exactly the people she could not rule out. "Ma'am," I said slowly, "you shouldn't be doing this alone." "I am aware." There was no self-pity in it. She said it the way she might report the weather. "I have been doing it alone because alone is the only company I could be sure of. Every person I might have brought in I've had to weigh. Could they be the leak? And if they aren't, will bringing them in put them in danger? And if it puts them in danger, do I have the right? She looked at me again, and something in her face changed, not softened exactly, but opened a fraction, the way a hand opens when it decides to stop being a fist. And now here you are, the steady one. The one the officers put on the dullest post because nothing ever happens there. Tell me, Aldwin, are you the leak? I understood she was half in earnest. No, Your Highness. No, she agreed. You're not. I've watched you for 13 years without knowing your name, and I know exactly what you are. You're the man who logs the truth and goes home, which means you are the one person in this wing tonight who I can be certain wants nothing from my illness except for it to stay mine. She drew a breath. I am going to make you an offer, and you are free to refuse it. And if you refuse it, I will send you back to your post, and neither of us will speak of this again, and no harm will come to you. But if you accept it, understand that you are stepping off the edge of your job into something that could cost you the job entirely, and worse. So think before you answer. What's the offer? Help me find how they're doing it, she said. You have something I don't. You have the right to be in these corridors at 3 in the morning and no one thinks anything of it. You see the whole machine of this place from the inside, the shifts, the doors, the people who come and go and when. I see the surface. You see the plumbing. Between your eyes on the plumbing and mine on the record, we might find the crack the water's coming through before whoever it is realizes we're looking. She held my gaze. And you have one more thing, which is that no one would ever suspect that Corran Aldwin knows anything at all. There it was again, the dullness that was my whole reputation, offered to me now not as faint praise but as a weapon. I stood in the cold and felt the shape of the thing she was asking. It was against every line of my training to keep a secret from the Corps. It was against the log. It was, very possibly, against my continued employment, and my narrow flat, and my tolerant cat. And it was the first time in 13 years that anyone in that house had looked at me and seen not a fixture but a man who might matter. I'll help you, I said. She nodded once, as if she had known I would, and perhaps she had. Then the first rule is this. We are ordinary. You are a guardsman who does his rounds, and I am a princess who keeps her hours. And if anyone ever sees us within 10 feet of one another, we are exchanging a good evening and nothing more. We never meet the same way twice. We never write any of it down where it can be found. And if it goes wrong, if you're ever asked by anyone, what you know nothing, and you throw me to them, and you keep your post. That is an order, and I will hold you to it. Do you understand? I understand the order, ma'am, I said. I don't promise to obey that particular part of it. For the first time, something almost like a smile touched the corner of her mouth. No, she said. I don't suppose the steady ones ever do. She slipped the tablet inside her coat. Go back to your post. Give me 4 minutes to get clear and put the camera right. Tomorrow you'll do exactly what you always do. And the night after, when you walk your rounds at 2, you'll find that the door to the disused music room is unlocked, and you'll step inside for exactly 90 seconds to check it, as any diligent man would, and you'll find a folded paper behind the loose panel by the window. Read it, memorize it, and burn it in the grate. Can you do that? Yes, Your Highness. Then good night, Aldwin. She was already moving, quiet as water, toward the archive stair. At the head of it she paused and looked back at me once more, and in the blue lamplight her face was that of a woman who had been carrying a great weight alone for longer than 4 nights, years, perhaps, of being the careful one, the composed one, the one who did everything by the book, while somewhere in the machinery of her own house, a hand was reaching into the most private thing she owned, and passing it around like a coin. Thank you, she said, so low I nearly lost it. I had begun to think there was no one. Then she was gone down the stair, and a minute later the little red eye under the cornice woke and burned steady again, and I walked back to my post and stood the rest of the watch like a statue, and logged in my careful hand that the corridor camera at Station 7 had dropped offline at 12:41 and restored at 12:47. Cause unknown, recommend maintenance review, which was true, every word of it, and told no one anything. and was the first lie of omission I had ever committed in 13 years of telling the truth for a living. I did not sleep much when I got home. I sat with the cat on my chest and I turned the thing over. A sealed record, read and passed. 3 copies, 2 of them physical and accounted for, 1 of them digital and supposedly locked to 2 people in the whole world. If the physician's file was off the system and the archive copy had never been withdrawn, then the leak was coming out of the digital archive, the household medical archive proper, and it was coming out clean, without tripping the withdrawal register, which meant whoever was doing it either had the access to read that archive legitimately or had found a way to read it that the system did not record. The first was a very short list of people. The second was worse, because it meant the leak could be anyone with the skill and the nerve, and the house's own security could not be trusted to find them, and the only 2 people hunting them were a princess who could not be seen to hunt, and a guardsman whose entire value was that no one would believe he could hunt at all. I remember thinking, as the gray came up in the window and the cat began to demand her breakfast, they made a mistake, whoever they are. They looked at the whole house and picked the record of the one person careful enough to notice it was gone. And then they had the bad luck, on the 4th night of her looking, to have the dullest reliable man in the corps standing in the one corridor where she came out of the dark. It was not much of an advantage. But I had stood a great many night watches, and I had learned that a palace after midnight is not silent, it ticks, it settles, and if you are patient and you do not gossip and you do not speculate and you simply stand still and listen, sooner or later you will hear the sound that does not belong. I intended to hear it. That was the beginning, what it grew into over the next 11 nights, the false trail, the second record, the name I did not want to find, the thing that happened in the archive at the very end, is the rest of what I have to tell, and I will tell it in order, because the order is the only way to understand how a careful woman and a dull man took apart a scheme that the whole clever machinery of the house could not, or would not, see. The paper was where she said it would be. I found it on the second night exactly as she had described, the music room door unlocked, the loose panel by the window, a single folded sheet behind it. I stood inside for my 90 honest seconds. I did check the room. A man should not tell even a private lie about a thing he could as easily make true, and I read the paper by the light of the phone I kept for the hour. It was written in a small, exact hand, no salutation, no signature, nothing that could be traced to a person if it were found. It gave me 3 things. The first was a question. Who reviews the East Wing overnight camera logs, and how soon after the night are they reviewed? The second was an instruction. Learn the physical route the medical archive server takes, where the machine lives, who holds keys to that room, who has cleaned it or serviced it or entered it in the last month. The third was a warning, underlined once. Trust no assumption about who is loyal. The kindest face in this house may be the hand in the record. Move as if watched. I read it 3 times until I had it whole, and then I did as I was told and burned it in the little grate at the end of the music room, and I ground the ash with the toe of my boot until it was nothing, and I went back to my post. And I began, from that night, to be 2 men. One was Corran Aldwin, guardsman, steady, dull, doing his rounds and logging his truths and going home to his cat, and every soul in the house who saw me saw only that man, which was precisely the point. The other was a man conducting an investigation inside the first man's routine, using nothing but the freedoms the routine already granted him. The right to walk any corridor at any hour, the right to ask another guardsman an idle question, the right to notice. I should say something here about why the stillness came so easily to me, because it matters to what followed, and because the princess was right about it in a way she could not have known when she chose me. I had not always been a palace guardsman. Before the house I had stood a different kind of watch, years of it, in a service where a man's whole worth was measured by whether he could hold a position through the long empty hours when nothing happened and hold his nerve in the 1 hour when everything did. I had learned there that most of duty is waiting, and that the men who fail are not the ones who cannot fight but the ones who cannot wait, who fill the silence with movement, with talk, with guessing, and so are never truly still and never truly here. I had buried 2 friends who could not wait. I came out of that service quiet and dull and content to be quiet and dull, and I took the palace post because it asked of me the one thing I had left, which was the ability to stand and not break. 13 years I had stood and not broken, and no one had ever needed anything more of me than that, and I had told myself that was enough. So when the princess handed me her secret and called my dullness patience, she was handing me back a thing I had made myself forget I possessed. That stillness is not emptiness. It is a discipline, and a disciplined stillness aimed is a kind of power. I had spent 13 years aiming it at nothing. She gave me something to aim it at. Let me take her 3 assignments in turn, because the answers came in that order, and each one moved us. The camera logs were the easiest, and I had the answer inside 2 days, because the answer was a man I saw nightly. The East Wing overnight footage was pulled every morning at 7 by a duty technician in the household security office, and reviewed, spot reviewed, really. No one has time to watch 9 hours of an empty corridor, by whichever supervisor was on the desk. That much was ordinary. What was not ordinary, and what I only learned by loitering near the security office at shift change with a cup of tea I did not want, was that for the last several weeks the East Wing footage had been getting a second, closer review. Not by the duty supervisor, by the office of the controller of the household, the office that managed access, keys, records, and the flow of information through the house. I heard it from a young technician who thought it was a nuisance and said so freely to anyone who'd share a tea break. Everything East Wing flagged up to the controller's people now, he complained. Any camera drops offline, any door opens off schedule, we log it and send it up. Weeks of it. Somebody up there's got a bee in their bonnet about that wing. He had no idea he was telling a spy the shape of the net. Neither did I, at first, quite grasp what he'd handed me, but I carried it to the next drop, and when I wrote it out for the princess in my own small hand behind the loose panel, I understood what her face would do when she read it. Because the archive door was in the East Wing, the dead camera she had killed for 6 minutes on the first night was in the East Wing. And now I had learned that the East Wing, and only the East Wing, had been under a special watch by the controller's office for weeks, which meant that either the controller's office was hunting the leak too, honestly and quietly, in which case they were allies we could not identify ourselves to without risk, or the controller's office was the leak, and the special watch was not a net for the thief but the thief's own eyes, placed to see the moment anyone came sniffing at the source. There was no third reading that I could find. And I did not know which of the 2 it was. Neither, when she read it, did she. The second assignment took longer and cost me more sleep. The medical archive server, the physical machine that held the sealed digital records, did not live in the medical office, as I'd assumed. It lived, I discovered, in a windowless climate-controlled room in the sub-level beneath the West Range, a room the staff called the vault though it held no gold, only rows of humming machines behind a steel door with a keypad and a key lock both. I could not get inside. I had no business there, and a guardsman asking to see the server room is a guardsman who has just told everyone he is interested in the server room. But I did not need inside. I needed the list of who could get inside, and that I could assemble the way I assembled everything, by standing where people talked and being too dull to be worth guarding one's tongue around. Over 4 nights I built the list. The medical office's 2 records officers held keys for the obvious reasons. The head of household held keys for the machines. A cleaning crew serviced the sub-level, but not the vault itself. The vault was cleaned by a single trusted man on a monthly rotation, escorted. And this was the piece that made me sit down on an ammunition crate in the ready room and stare at the wall for a while. The controller of the household held a master key to the vault, as the controller held a master to nearly every door, because the whole point of the office was oversight of access. The same office now watching the East Wing held a key to the room where the leak source machine lived. I want to be honest about what I felt, because I have made a virtue of honesty, and I will not pretend to a detachment I did not have. I felt the pull to conclude. Everything pointed one way: the special watch, the master key, the standing to bury an investigation. It would have been the easiest thing in the world to write the controller's name behind the loose panel and let the princess and I close on him. But she had underlined a warning on the very first paper: trust no assumption about who is loyal, move as if watched. And I had been a guardsman long enough to know that the man everything points to is either guilty or being pointed at, and that the difference between those two is the whole of the truth. So I did not write a name. I wrote what I knew: the watch, the key, the vault, the list, and I added in my dull, careful hand one line of my own: it fits the controller too well. Ask who benefits, not who could. I did not know, writing it, that I had just put my finger on the exact hinge the whole thing turned on. I only knew it felt wrong to hang a man on convenience, and that the princess had a better mind than mine and would want the doubt as much as the fact. Her reply, 3 nights on, was the longest paper she ever left me, and it changed the shape of everything. She had, she wrote, done what I asked. She had asked who benefits. And she had made herself sit with a truth she had been avoiding, which was that the leak of her medical record had not been random or mercenary. No money had changed hands, no scandal sheet had run it, no enemy of the house had wielded it. The record had gone, as far as she could trace its effects, to precisely one place. It had reached the ears of the king. Quietly. Framed. Delivered not as raw data but as a story built around it, a story about the princess's health and what it meant, and what ought therefore to be done about her place in the house, her duties, her standing, her future. Someone was not selling her illness. Someone was using it. Someone wanted the king to look at his careful, composed daughter and see, instead, a fragile thing to be managed, set aside, moved gently out of the way of matters she was no longer thought fit to touch. And the person who gained by that, she wrote, the person for whom a diminished, sidelined Elara was worth the enormous risk of reaching into a sealed medical archive, was not a records officer, who gained nothing, nor an IT head who gained nothing, nor even the controller, unless the controller were someone's instrument. The person who gained was whoever stood to rise as Elara fell. She did not write the name. She was too careful for that even behind a loose panel in a locked room. But I read the paper by phone light in the music room, and I felt the cold come up through the floor, because I did not need her to write it. There was in that house one figure whose whole long game was the slow rearrangement of the succession and the standing of the king's true children, one figure who had married into the house and had never stopped counting the distance between her own children and the throne. And if the Princess Elara could be quietly recast as too unwell to matter, then the counting got easier. The queen consort, Morwenna. I burned the paper and ground the ash and stood a long time in the dark, because a thing had just moved from a puzzle about a computer to a war over a woman's place in her own family, and I was in it now up to my collar, and there was no honest way back out. We changed our method after that night because the stakes had changed. Up to then we had been surveying, mapping the machine, learning the ground. Now we had a shape to prove, and proving it meant we had to do the one thing the princess had feared from the start. We had to touch the source, and touching the source risked showing our hand. A leak that is only suspected can be watched. A leak that knows it is watched changes its route or goes quiet, and a leak gone quiet can never be proven, and an unproven suspicion of the queen consort is a knife that cuts only the hand that holds it. If we moved wrong, Elara would not merely fail to expose Morwenna. She would hand Morwenna the very thing she was building, proof that the princess was unwell in her mind, seeing plots, accusing the queen of monstrous things without evidence. The trap she was in was perfect in that way. To defend herself she had to accuse. To accuse without proof was to confirm the story being told about her. And to get proof, she had to move against people who would see her moving. She said it to me once, On one of the nights we risked a few whispered minutes in the dark of the music room rather than the paper. You see the elegance of it, Aldwin. Whatever I do to save myself looks like the illness they've invented for me. If I sit still, I'm managed out. If I fight, I'm mad. The only way through is to be so quiet and so sure that when I finally speak, there is nothing left to argue about. I said that sounded like standing a post. She said yes. That was the moment, I think, that she stopped being a princess I guarded and became a person I was standing the post beside. Our next move was to prove the mechanism, to prove not just that the record had leaked, but exactly how it had come out of a sealed archive without leaving a trace. Because that was the crack no story could paper over. If we could show the physical path, this key, this machine, this hand, this hour, then it would not matter how the king had been prepared to see his daughter. A fact laid on the table ends an argument that a suspicion only starts. The princess had access to something I did not. She could, quietly and by her own right as one of the two people the archive was sealed to, request an access audit of her own record. Every time a sealed record is opened, the system is supposed to write a line who, when, from which terminal. It is the one thing the archive does that even a thief cannot easily undo, because the audit log is written to a place separate from the records themselves. She had not requested it earlier for the reason she had not done anything earlier through official channels. The request itself would be logged, and whoever watched the archive would see the princess auditing her own record and know she was hunting. But we had reached the point where the risk of moving was smaller than the risk of standing still, and so she requested it, not through the medical office, but directly in person, from the one archivist she had decided, after weeks of weighing every face in the house, that she could trust. I met that archivist, in a manner of speaking, on the 9th night, though she never knew what I was. Her name was Wren Halloran, a small, precise woman of perhaps 60 who had kept the house's records for 30 years and had, the princess judged, exactly one loyalty, which was to the integrity of the records themselves. She was not political. She had watched 3 generations of the house use and misuse her archive, and had survived by caring only that the lines be true. If anyone in the house would give Elara a clean audit without asking why and without whispering that she'd asked, it was Halloran. And Halloran, when she ran the audit of the princess's sealed medical record, went very pale and very quiet and asked the princess to sit down, because the audit log told a story of its own. The record had been opened. Not once, 11 times over 5 months, always in the small hours, always from the same terminal. And the terminal was not in the medical office, nor in the controller's office, nor anywhere a records officer or an IT head would sit. The terminal was one of the general administrative machines in the West Range, a shared workstation used by a rotating pool of household clerks and aides, a machine so ordinary that 100 people passed it in a day. Whoever was reading the princess's record had not used their own credentials. They had used the archive's own back door, the emergency access account, the one built into every such system, so that a physician can reach a record in a crisis when the ordinary owner is unconscious and cannot consent. That account left a line in the audit log, as everything did, but it left the account's name, not the person's, and the account's name was Household Medical Emergency Access. Someone had been walking through the crisis door, month after month at 3 in the morning to read a woman's most private pages, and the log recorded only that the crisis door had opened, never whose hand. I understood, when the princess told me this at our next meeting, why the withdrawal register had been clean and why the leak had seemed to come out of nowhere. No record had been withdrawn because no record needed to be. No credential had been misused because the emergency account was not misused, exactly. It was used, precisely as built, by someone who had the emergency account's password. And the emergency account's password was not held by many. It was held by the medical office. It was held by it. And it was held because the office existed to hold every key to every door for exactly the emergency the account was named for by the controller of the household. There was, before we came back to the controller, one more thing the audit turned up that nearly sent us down the wrong road entirely. And I said it here, because it shows how narrow the margin was between finding the truth and being buried by a false one. Halloran, running the audit deeper at the princess's request, found that the princess's medical record was not the only sealed file the shared Westrange terminal had touched in those 5 months. There was a second. Another sealed record had been opened from that same machine, in the same dead hours, using the same emergency access account. And when Halloran, gone very still, checked whose it was the record of the late Queen Isolde, the king's first wife, dead these long years, her file sealed and dormant and touched by no one since the day it closed. Someone had been reading a dead queen's medical record alongside the living princess's. For a night the princess and I both went cold with a wrong idea that this was some larger, stranger scheme, some plot reaching back into the house's grief. But the truth, when we worried it out, was simpler and colder, and told us more about our thief than anything yet. Isolde's record and Elara's record sat next to each other in the archive's index, filed under the same family line. Whoever walked the crisis door had not gone straight to Elara's file like someone who knew exactly where it lived. They had opened the family line and browsed, reading first the dead mother's pages, then the living daughter's, the way a person searches who is looking for something and does not quite know its shape. A records officer would have gone straight to the file. A physician would have gone straight to the file. Only someone from outside the medical world, someone with the password but not the training, would have opened the whole family line and read down through it, curious, thorough, and cold. It narrowed the hand for us more than any key or camera had. It was not a professional. It was an amateur with a master's access, someone high enough to hold the emergency password and low enough in medical knowledge to browse a dead woman's file looking for a living woman's weakness. That was not a records officer, and it was not the IT head, and it fit, with a chill, exactly one person we had been circling. We were back in the end at the controller. Everything, every path led to that office, and it had led there so cleanly and so many times that the princess and I sat in the dark of the music room on the 10th night and looked at each other and said, almost together, the same thing. It's too clean. She said it the way I'd written it 4 nights before. It fits too well. Because think, she said, of who the controller was. A career official, 20 years in the house, meticulous, cautious, a man whose whole life was the correct handling of access. Would such a man read a sealed record 11 times from a shared clerk's terminal using the one account that would flag if anyone ever looked? A man with a master key to the vault itself, who could have read the record at the source, in a locked room with no shared machine and no crisis door flag at all. It made no sense. The controller had the means to do it invisibly and had instead been done invisibly. Every path routed through his office, his key, his account's password, until anyone who investigated would arrive, exhausted and certain, at his door. We're not looking at the thief, Elara said quietly. We're looking at the man they've dressed as the thief. Someone used his passwords and his account and his office's fingerprints and set it all in his wing, so that if I ever did what I'm doing now, I'd find him and stop, satisfied. He's not the hand in my record, Aldwin. He's the glove they meant me to find on the floor. Then whose hand? I said. Where's the controller for a glove? She did not answer, because we both knew, and because knowing was still not proving, and because the whole art of the thing was that between the hand and the record stood the controller, and between the controller and the truth stood the small brute fact that we could not yet show a single moment when the real hand had touched a single real key. The emergency access account had a password. Someone with that password had been reading the record. The controller held that password, but so did the medical office, so did it, and so, we had to assume, did anyone the true schemer had reached inside those offices. The audit log gave us the door and the hour and the borrowed name. It did not give us the face. To get the face we would have to catch the hand in the act, to know a night the crisis door would open, and to be watching the shared terminal when it did. And that, it turned out, was a thing we could arrange, because a hunter who reads a record 11 times over 5 months is a hunter who will read it a 12th. The princess had noticed, poring over the audit log with Halloran, that the reads clustered. They came in the days before something happened, before a family council, before a decision about her duties, before any moment when a fresh, well-timed word about her health might tip the king. And there was such a moment coming. In 8 days the house would hold its spring council, at which, among much else, the division of certain of the princess's patronages and responsibilities was down to be discussed, a discussion that had appeared on the agenda, Elara noted grimly, at the queen consort's suggestion, framed as a kindness, a lightening of the dear princess's load in light of her delicate health. If the pattern held, the hand would want fresh ammunition. The hand would open the crisis door one more time in the nights before the council. And this time, someone would be watching the terminal it opened from. "You can't watch it," Elara said. "Your east wing, the terminal's west range, and a guardsman standing over a clerk's workstation at 3 in the morning is the loudest thing in the palace. If it's you, they'll see the watcher and never come." She was right, and it stung, because I had wanted it to be me. I had, I confess, begun to want to be the hand that closed on the thing, which is a want a guardsman is supposed to have burned out of him. But she went on, and there was the first real light I'd seen in her face in 10 nights. "There is one person in this house whose presence near that terminal at any hour would surprise no one, whose loyalty I no longer have to guess at, and who has been aching for a way to help ever since she ran that audit and understood what had been done to my pages." She meant Halloran, the archivist. The one person whose whole life was the truth of the record, who had gone pale at what she found, and who, the princess had reason to know, kept odd hours in the West Range as a matter of course, because 30 years of archiving had made her a creature of the small, quiet hours when no one interrupted the work. So the plan took its final shape, there in the dark, 8 days out from the council. Halloran would find reasons to be at work in the West Range in the small hours on each of the nights before the council, nothing unusual, nothing anyone would question, only a diligent old archivist at her desk. She would have quiet eyes on the shared terminal. She would not confront, not challenge, not so much as look up sharply. She would only see who sat down at that machine in the dead hours, and, if she could, what they did. And I, dull, steady, East Wing Aldwin, whom no one would ever place at the center of anything, would be the thread that tied it together, the one who could move between the wings on legitimate rounds, carry word without paper, and be, if the worst came, the witness whose log was worth something precisely because he was known never to lie in it. "One more thing," the princess said, as we parted that night. "If we're right, the person who opens that door is not going to be some hireling we can hand to the guard. It's going to be someone whose word weighs more than ours, in a house where weight of word is everything. So we don't catch them to accuse them. We catch them to make the fact undeniable, the who, the when, the hand on the key, and then we take the fact to the one person in this house whose judgment cannot be bought or frightened or outranked." She meant the king, but she also meant I would learn someone else, a name she had been holding in reserve since the very first night, a person she trusted to make the king listen even against the queen consort's whisper. "Stand your post, Aldwin," she said. 8 nights. And then we finish it. There was a cost to those 8 nights that I have not yet named, and it is the cost that made the whole thing more than a puzzle to me, so I will name it now. On the second of them I understood, for the first time, what the leak had already done in the daylight world while the princess and I hunted it in the dark. It reached me the way everything reached me, sideways in the ready room, from 2 younger guardsmen who did not know I cared. They were talking about the princess, idly, the way men talk on a slow watch, and one of them said he'd heard she wasn't well, that it was serious, that there was talk of her being stepped back from the summer duties and even from the children's schooling matters, that the king's own consort was said to be worried sick over her. He said it kindly. That was the poison of it, he said it kindly. A decent young man repeating a thing he'd been given to repeat, with no idea he was carrying a weapon. And I stood there in the ready room polishing a buckle that did not need polishing, and I felt the true reach of the thing for the first time, because this was not a document in an archive anymore. This was a story, out in the corridors, in the mouths of good men who meant no harm, softening the ground under a woman's feet a whisper at a time. By the time the council met, the king would not be hearing a fresh accusation. He would be hearing the confirmation of a thing everyone already knew. That is how it is done in a great house, not with a blow, with a climate. I carried it to the drop, and it was the only time in all our exchanges that the princess's reply came back changed, not the exact small hand, but the same hand pressed too hard, the pen dug into the paper. She had heard the whispers too, she wrote. She had heard them from her own children. Little Bram had asked her, in the plain, terrible way of a small boy, whether she was going to have to go away, because Torrin had heard a lady say so, and she had knelt and told him no, of course not, and had held herself together until he ran off and then had not held together at all. That was what the leak had bought its maker, a woman kneeling to reassure her frightened boy about a lie that had been built out of her own private pages. I read it and burned it and stood in the dark of the music room with my jaw set, and whatever detachment I had brought to the hunt burned with the paper. It was not a case now. It was a wrong, and I meant to see it put right. The 8 nights nearly broke us after that, and they did it in the cruelest way a plan can be broken, not by failing, but by seeming, in the middle, to succeed too easily. The first 3 nights, nothing. Halloran sat at her desk in the West Range with the shared terminal in the edge of her vision, and the terminal sat dark, and the small hours passed and nothing touched the crisis door. I carried her nothing to the princess, and the princess carried her nothing back to me, and we told ourselves the pattern would hold, the hand would come, only wait. It is a strange thing to want a crime to be committed, and I felt the strangeness, standing my East Wing watch, praying the thief would come out of hiding so that we could end them. On the 4th night, I nearly undid the whole thing myself, and I will tell it because I am not in the business of making myself the clean one in this account. On the 4th night, at a little past 2, I was walking my rounds and I came around the corner by the linen stores, and I found the controller of the household standing in the East Wing corridor, in person, at 2 in the morning. The man himself, Lord Bramwell, they called him, though the title was a courtesy of the office. A spare gray careful man I had seen 1,000 times by day and never once at night. He was standing outside the archive door with a ring of keys in his hand and a look on his face I could not read, and every conclusion we had spent 10 nights building told me in a hot rush that I was wrong, that the controller was the thief after all, that here he was at the source with his master keys in the dead of night, and I felt my whole body decide to challenge him. And I nearly did. I nearly stepped out and said, "Lord Bramwell, what is your business at this door at this hour?" in the loud, plain voice of a guardsman who has caught something, which would have told him, and through him whoever moved him, that the East Wing had a watcher who was awake. I did not. I do not fully know why I did not, except that the princess's underlined warning came up in me at the last instant, move as if watched. The man everything points to is either guilty or being pointed at, and I held. I stayed in the shadow between the lamps, the dull, steady statue, and I watched, and the controller did not open the archive door. He stood before it, and he tried 3 keys in the lock and none turned, and he cursed under his breath in the tired way of a man defeated by ordinary logistics, and then he took out a phone and made a low call, and from what I caught of it, an apology, a reference to an audit, a promise to have it right by the council. I understood the truth of what I was seeing, which was so much smaller and so much stranger than a thief at his work. The controller had been ordered by someone above him to prepare a full accounting of archive access for the spring council. He had come himself, at an hour when the archive was quiet and he would not be interrupted, to check the physical locks and logs against the digital ones. He was not stealing. He was auditing the very system that had been used to frame him, on the orders of the very hand that had framed him, and he did not know it. He was the glove, being made to polish itself for the moment it would be laid on the table as the guilty party. I watched a decent, tired, meticulous man do a thorough job of building the case against himself, and I understood at last the full cold reach of the mind we were up against, and I said nothing, and I let him finish and lock up and go, and I logged only that the controller had inspected the archive door at 2:14, on stated business of the coming council, true and useless to anyone but us. I carried it to the drop, and the princess read it, and I saw, when we risked our 30 whispered seconds the next night, that it had shaken her as much as it had shaken me, not because it accused Bramwell, but because it exonerated him, and every man exonerated moved the hand one step closer to the one name she did not want to be right about. "It's not him," she said. I'd half hoped, God forgive me, that it was him. It would have been so much cleaner if the thief were a functionary I could hand to the guard by morning. She pressed her fingers to her eyes. "But you've just watched them use him. They sent an honest man to build their frame for them. Do you understand what that means about who's directing this? It means someone with the standing to give the controller of the household his orders and the coldness to make him incriminate himself and never see it. There was only one office in the house with standing over the controller that was not the king's own, and the king would not do this to his own daughter, which left the consort who signed as the king's hand when the king's hand was busy elsewhere. That was the false dawn, and it curdled into the setback on the 6th night, when everything nearly came apart. On the 6th night, Halloran did not come to work. I learned it the way I learned everything, sideways, from a Westrange porter grumbling that old Miss Halloran had been sent home poorly, and the records desk was covered by a temp who didn't know a ledger from a lunch menu. My blood went cold. Halloran was our eyes on the terminal. 2 nights before the council, with the reeds due to cluster, our watcher was gone. I could not go to the princess directly. It was not a drop night, and to seek her out off pattern was exactly the kind of loud move we'd sworn off. And so I did the only thing I could, which was to find out why Halloran was gone before I panicked. It took me until nearly dawn, trading tea and dullness for scraps, but I got it. Halloran had not fallen ill on her own. She had been sent home, ordered to take rest, kindly, solicitously, by a note from the controller's office which had noticed, it said, that the good archivist had been keeping unhealthy late hours and wished her to look after herself. The note was signed by the controller, but the controller, I would have wagered my post, had never written it. Someone had noticed an old archivist keeping odd hours in the West Range in the nights before the council, and had gently, plausibly in the controller's name, as everything was done in someone else's name, removed her. The hand had felt the watcher without seeing her, and had brushed her aside without a fingerprint. I understood then that we were not hunting alone, we were being hunted back. Not identified. If we'd been identified, I'd have been reassigned or worse, but sensed. The hand knew someone was near the source and was clearing the ground before the last read. And the last read was coming, tomorrow night or the night after, and we had just lost our eyes. I have never in my life wanted so badly to break protocol and run to the princess with the alarm. I did not. I did something duller, and I have come to think braver, because it was harder. I trusted the plan and the woman who'd made it, and I found the one channel we had that could not be brushed aside in a night. On my morning off, I did not go home to my cat. I put on my plain coat and I went, as any citizen might, to the small public chapel that stood at the edge of the palace grounds where staff and townsfolk alike went to sit, and I sat, and after a while, because the princess and I had built exactly one fallback into all our arrangements, one place and 1 hour where either of us would go if the drops failed, she came, in a plain coat of her own, and knelt a few feet away as if in prayer. And under the cover of that quiet we spoke without looking at each other, 2 strangers in a chapel, and I told her about Halloran. She was silent for a long moment. Then she said, so low it was barely breath, "Then we've no watcher for the last read, and the last read is our only proof, and it comes in a night, maybe 2. Another silence. Aldwin. I have to ask you to be the watcher after all. The thing I said we couldn't do, a guard over the terminal, I have to ask you to find a way to do it invisibly, because there's no one else. And if we miss this read, we miss everything, and I'm out of knights." She turned her head a fraction, and I saw that the composed princess was, under it all, very near the end of her strength. Weeks of this, months of her own most private pages being read in the dark, and now the last thread fraying in her hand. "I know what I'm asking. If they catch you at that terminal, they'll know, and they'll bury it, and you'll lose your post and I'll lose my proof. But I would rather lose everything trying than be managed quietly out of my own family without a fight. So I'm asking." And I, who had spent 13 years being the man who would not surprise you, surprised her. "You don't have to ask me to watch the terminal, Your Highness," I said to the front of the chapel, not to her, "because I already know how it can be watched by a man who has every right to be exactly there, at exactly that hour, and whom no one will look at twice." I had been turning it over since the porter told me about Halloran, and it had come to me the way the answers always came to me, out of the dullness, out of the plumbing of the place that I knew and the schemers did not. The shared terminal in the West Range. It sits in the clerk's anteroom, yes, off the main West Corridor. And the main West Corridor, 2 nights a month, is walked on overnight fire-in lock rounds, not by household security, by the building staff, checking the old range for damp and faults, because the West Range is the oldest part, and the king insisted on it after the flood 3 winters back. I know the man who walks it. I've covered his round twice when he was sick. It is the most invisible errand in the palace, a man with a torch and a clipboard checking radiators at 3 in the morning, and it goes straight past the clerk's anteroom, and it happens I checked before I came here tomorrow night. I let it sit. I'll take his round. I'll be a buildings man with a torch and a clipboard, checking the West Range for damp, as dull and expected as the damp itself. And I'll be standing 30 feet from that terminal at 3 in the morning, with every right in the world to be there." She was quiet, and then she breathed out, and it was almost a laugh, the exhausted laugh of someone who has been carrying a stone uphill and felt it, for 1 step, get lighter. "The dullest reliable man in the corps," she said. "They should have been afraid of you from the first." The next night, I became a buildings man. It was not hard to arrange. The fellow whose round it was, a good-natured man named Pole who owed me for the 2 covers and asked no questions, was glad enough to hand off a shift for a favor to be named later. And household routine is such that a man in the plain gray coverall of the building staff with a torch and a clipboard, and a known face is the closest thing a palace has to furniture. I drew the West Range round at midnight. I walked it slow and thorough, and I did check the radiators, because a man should not tell even a private lie he can make true, and I noted a real damp patch behind the old paneling by the second stair that Pole would thank me for. And a little before 3 I came, on my honest slow round, to the clerk's anteroom off the main West Corridor, and I found a reason to be at the far end of it. A fault board on the wall, a legitimate thing to stand before with a torch and a clipboard, and I set myself there, gray and dull and expected, 30 feet from the shared terminal, and I waited. I want to describe the terminal because I stared at it for so long that night it is burned into me. It sat on a plain desk against the inner wall, a shared machine gone slightly amber with age, its screen dark, a chair pushed in neat before it. An ordinary thing, 100 people a day. And in 5 months, 11 times in the dead hours, a hand had sat in that chair and walked through the crisis door to read a woman's private pages, and no one had ever once looked up. I stood at my fault board, and I did the thing I have done better than anything else in my life, which is to be still, and to wait, and to not be worth guarding one's tongue around. And the palace ticked and settled around me, and the clock that has never been right chimed a wrong hour somewhere far off, and I waited. At 11 minutes past 3, the anteroom door opened. I did not turn. I had schooled myself not to turn. A buildings man absorbed in a fault board does not turn at every draft. I watched in the black glass of the fault board's cover, which I had chosen for exactly this, the way it caught the room behind me in a dim, warped mirror. And in that dark glass I saw a figure come into the anteroom, not furtive. That was the thing that struck me, not creeping, but easy, unhurried, entitled, the walk of someone who has never in their life had to explain their presence anywhere, cross to the desk, and sit down in the chair before the shared terminal and wake the screen. The amber light lit a face in the black glass, warped and dim, and I made myself not sharpen my focus, not lean, not do anything a still man would not do. But I did not need to sharpen it. I knew the outline. I had guarded doors this figure walked through for 13 years. It was not the controller. It was not a clerk or an aide or a hireling. It was a woman in a fine dark robe with her hair loose for the night, and even warped in the glass, there was no mistaking the carriage of the queen consort, Morwenna, sitting down in a shared clerk's chair at 3 in the morning to open, for the 12th time, the sealed medical record of the king's daughter. I will tell you what I felt, and it was not triumph. It was a kind of grief. Because up to that moment it had been a shape we were proving, a hand we were tracing, and now it was a woman I had watched come and go for 13 years. A woman the house called Your Majesty, sitting alone in an ugly amber light doing a small cold thing to a person who had never done her any harm, and the smallness of it, the pettiness of the great scheme reduced to a robed woman at a borrowed keyboard, was the saddest thing I had seen in all my years in that place. She typed. I heard the emergency access account go in, the crisis door open the way it had opened 11 times before. She read. Her face, in the black glass, was not cruel. It was calculating and a little tired, the face of someone doing sums, and I realized she believed, sitting there, that she was perfectly safe. That the frame was built, the controller polished, the archivist sent home, the ground cleared, that she could walk through the crisis door as often as she liked, and the only fingerprint would be an emergency account that pointed, if it pointed anywhere, at an office full of other people. She had thought of everything. She had thought of everything except a damp patch behind the second stair paneling, and a favor owed to the dullest reliable man in the Corps. And here I must be exact about what I did and did not do, because it is the hinge of the whole thing, and I have turned it over 10,000 times. I did not step out and challenge her. I did not say, Your Majesty, what is your business at this terminal? I had learned that lesson in the East Wing corridor with the controller. The loud challenge tells the schemer she is watched, and a schemer who knows she is watched changes everything and can never be proven. And a challenge from me, a buildings man, a guardsman in a borrowed coverall, against the word of the queen consort was worth exactly nothing. She would deny it, and it would be my nothing word against her everything word, and I would lose my post and she would go on. No. The plan had never been to catch her and accuse her. The plan was to make the fact undeniable and take it to the one judgment that could not be bought or outranked. And the fact was being made, right now, in the one place it could not be denied, because the terminal she sat at, the shared machine gone amber with age, was writing, as she read, a fresh line in the audit log. The emergency account, opened at this terminal at this hour on this night. And this time we would be able to prove who sat in the chair, because this time there was a witness of record standing 30 feet away with a clipboard, and because the Princess and Halloran had, on Halloran's last night before she was sent home, done one quiet thing more that I did not learn of until later. So I did the hardest thing a man of action can do, which is nothing. I stood at my fault board, a still gray man checking radiators, and I let the queen consort read the record and rise and push in the chair neat. She pushed the chair in neat, tidy even in this, and walk out of the anteroom the way she had come, easy and unhurried and entitled, never once glancing at the building's man at the far wall, because who looks at the furniture? And when she was gone, I noted the time on my clipboard, 3:19, and the date, and the plain fact of what I had seen in my own eyes, in my own careful hand, in a log that this time I would not be told to keep silent. And I finished my honest round, damp patch and all, and I did not run, and I did not tell a soul, And at 7 in the morning I went home to my cat and I sat in the gray light and I wept a little, which surprised me, because I am not a weeping man. But I had just watched the smallness of a great cruelty, and something in me needed to let the water through. The proof was made. What remained was the harder thing, which was to lay it before the one person who could act on it, and to do so in a way that even the queen consort's word could not turn aside. That was the princess's part, and she had prepared it while I watched the terminal, and it is where the name she had held in reserve since the first night finally came into the light. The name was Princess Elara, the king's own sister, the one figure in the house whose standing rivaled the queen consort's and whose loyalty to the king's blood was beyond any purchase. Elara had chosen her weeks before, in the long dark arithmetic of who could be trusted, and had gone to her 3 days prior with everything we had built, the audit log, the 11 reeds, the framed controller, the sent-home archivist, the pattern clustering toward the council, and had asked for one thing, that Elara be ready. Elara, it turned out, had needed less convincing than Elara feared. The old princess had been watching Morwenna's slow campaign for years with a cold eye and had wanted, she said, only ever one thing, proof she could set before her brother that even his fondness for his consort could not argue away. And now she had it because Halloran, on her last night before the gentle note sent her home, had done the quiet thing I mentioned. She had set the archive to write a verified integrity stamp on the next emergency access event. A cryptographic seal, she called it, a thing that could not be forged or deleted, that would prove beyond any denial that the read of 3:19 had happened from that terminal at that hour, on that night, exactly as logged. My eyes were the witness that a person had sat in the chair. Halloran's seal was the proof that the crisis door had been walked through in that same minute, and the two together, laid side by side, were a fact no word could turn aside. The spring council met 2 days later, and I was not in the room because a guardsman is never in the room. But I stood my post at the door of it in my own red tunic again, and I heard, through the good oak enough. I heard the agenda reach the item the queen consort had planted, the gentle lightening of the dear princess's load, in light of her delicate health, and I heard Morwenna's voice take it up, warm and solicitous, building the story she had spent 5 months and 11 midnight reads assembling. The princess was unwell, was fragile, was perhaps not herself, and it would be a kindness, would it not, to relieve her of the strain of her duties. And I heard, when she had finished, the king begin to answer in the slow, troubled voice of a father half persuaded, and then I heard another voice cut across it, level and cold and old, the voice of Princess Elara. I will not pretend to remember it word for word through a door, but I have the shape of it, and Elara gave me the rest afterward. Elara asked mildly how the queen consort had come to know so much about the princess's health. A sealed matter, was it not? Consent only. And when Morwenna answered smoothly that these things become known, that a caring house notices, Elara laid a folder on the table. Inside it was the audit log, 11 reads, 5 months, always the small hours, always the emergency access account, always the same shared terminal in the West Range. Inside it was Halloran's integrity seal on the 12th read, dated 2 nights before at 3:19. And inside it was the sworn, signed statement of a buildings-round man, of guardsman Corran Aldwin, standing at that moment on the far side of the very door, who had seen, with his own eyes in a black glass, the person who sat down in that chair at that hour and read the sealed record of the king's daughter. Elara did not accuse. She simply asked the king to read the folder, and then to ask his consort a single question, where she had been at 11 minutes past 3, 2 nights ago. There was a long silence behind the oak. I have stood many silences in that house, and I know their kinds, and this was the kind that comes when a story that has been carefully built for months meets a fact it cannot climb over and dies. When the king spoke again, his voice was not troubled anymore. It was quiet and terrible, the voice of a man who has just understood what has been done to his daughter, and by whom, and I heard in it the end of something. The end of the Queen Consort's long, patient campaign, not in a shout or a scandal, but in the small, unanswerable question of where she had been at 3:19. I did not see what happened to Morwenna, and I am glad of it, because it was a family's grief and not a guardsman's business. But I know what came of it, because the house is a machine and I know its plumbing. The king did not make a public ruin of his consort. That is not how such houses right themselves. But the campaign was over and everyone who mattered knew it. The Queen Consort's access to the archive was stripped that day. The emergency access account was rebuilt from the ground up, its password held now by two people who could not act without the other. The controller, Lord Bramwell, was quietly told the truth of how his office had been used, and I am told the meticulous gray man wept, which I understand better than I once would have. And the proposal to lighten the dear princess's load vanished from every agenda and was never spoken of again. And the Princess Elara kept every one of her duties and her standing and her place in her own family, which was all she had ever fought for. She had not wanted to ruin anyone. She had wanted only to stay herself in her own house, undiminished, with her most private pages her own again. She got it. Wren Halloran came back to her records desk within the week, unbothered thereafter in her odd hours, and if she guessed the whole shape of what she'd helped do, she never said, because her loyalty was to the truth of the record and the record was true again, and that was enough for her. The princess saw to it, quietly, that the old archivist wanted for nothing in her retirement when it came. As for me, I feared for my post through all of it. I had kept secrets from the Corps, killed a camera by proxy, worn another man's coverall, and lied by omission in my log for 11 nights, and a guardsman is his reliability or he is nothing. I made no excuse for it. I stood before my captain when the thing was done and I told him plainly what I had done and why, and I offered him my resignation, because a man who has bent the rules ought to be the first to say so, even in a good cause. He did not take it. He looked at me a long while and then he said the Corps existed to protect the house, and that I had protected the house when the house's own machinery could not, and that if he wanted men who would never bend a rule to do right he'd have hired statues, and the palace had enough of those. Then he told me to get back to my post, and I did. The princess sent for me once after, on an ordinary afternoon in an ordinary room, with the door open and everything correct. No more dark corridors, no more paper behind loose panels. She thanked me properly, as a person thanks a person, and she said a thing I have kept. She said that on the first night, when she came out of the archive and found me in the corridor, she had thought her luck had run out, the one guardsman in the wing, a witness she'd have to send away or trust, and she'd had no reason to trust me except that the officers called me dull and reliable. I trusted you because you were dull, she said, and she smiled when she said it. And it turned out that dull in the right man is only patience and steadiness and the refusal to look away, and those are the three things I needed most in the whole world, and no clever man in this house had any of them. She was quiet a moment. Thank you for being still, Aldwin. And thank you in the end for moving. I have stood a great many night watches in the east wing of Harrowgate since, and the palace still ticks and settles after midnight, still knocks in its pipes and chimes its wrong hours, and I still stand my post and log my truths and go home to my cat. To anyone who asks, I am what I always was. Aldwin, steady, won't surprise you. They mean it as praise and I take it as such, but I know now what the word is really worth. A secret can walk past a dull man because it thinks he will not understand what he sees. It is the last mistake such a secret ever makes. For the dull man is only the patient one, the still one, the one who does not gossip and does not speculate and simply stands in the dark and listens. Until, on some cold night when the careful ones have grown careless, he hears at last the one sound in all that ticking, settling house that does not belong. And then, God help whoever made it, he moves.